Hello, everybody. I'm about to get into meatball madness here, and I wanted to share some of my secrets with you because some of my Italian friends tell me I make the best meatball. We basically have three components to a good meatball. We have the ingredients, we have the incorporation of the ingredients, which is super important, and then we have the cooking process. So, firstly, my meatballs, I like to use a combination of ground beef and ground pork. I use a 2-to-1 ratio, so 2 pounds of ground beef to 1 pound of ground pork. 80-20 is fine, 90-10 is fine. I also use some breadcrumbs, not a lot though. I use granulated garlic or fresh garlic. I use granulated onion, fresh parsley diced, oregano, dried basil. But here's where the secret ingredients come in. I do use Worcestershire sauce. I do like to sprinkle pepper in my batch. Tons of cheese. I can't emphasize that enough. Tons of cheese, grated cheese. I do like Romano a little bit better than Parmesan. It's a little bit tangier. And by that, at the Italian store, I have them grate that right off the block. I do use eggs as a binder, usually about 1 egg per pound of meat. But the secret ingredient is that I finish off the mixture with heavy cream. I learned that from one of my chefs when I was a restaurant owner. He was actually a Mexican, and he was classically trained in Italian. He showed me that trick, and he made the most amazing meatball. So, heavy cream. Now, the next thing, which is equally important, is incorporation. How do we put the ingredients together? My grandmother used to put everything in a bowl, and then she'd dump everything on top of the bowl, all the other ingredients, and then she would start mushing everything with her hands. Okay. First of all, the more you work ground beef, the tougher it gets. It'll produce a meatball that actually is going to be a little denser and a little bit harder, and we want to avoid that. At least I do. So, and the other problem is if you can picture a bowl and putting a blob of meat in the bowl and then, dumping in a tablespoon of whatever, you're counting on having perfectly distributed that tablespoon of whatever in that ball of meat, and it simply is, it's almost impossible. Picture, putting a little crater with your thumb at the top of the meat, put a tablespoon of salt in, and start mixing that like this, crunching it together. A lot of that salt could potentially stay in one little spot and move around that ball as you're blobbing it around. Okay, so the incorporation part's really important. What I do is I take a full size catering pan, a hotel pan, and first I distribute evenly the ground beef, and then I'll throw in a few of those other ingredients that I mentioned in an even layer, and then I will fragment my ground pork on top of that, and I will disperse the remainder of all the ingredients. So basically every single level is built up uniformly, where each ingredient is equal on each level of the mixture, and then I start to mix everything up. It incorporates very quickly. You don't have to work the meat too much, and everything it gets worked in uniformly. I forgot to mention that the double top secret ingredient in the mixture is pesto. So I use pesto in the summertime. If I make meatballs, I make the pesto myself, but now I buy pesto from Costco. They have a jar. I think it's at least 16 ounces. It's very good. And you layer that in as well. It gives the meatball just an unbelievable flavor. Now, the next part is the cooking process. Now, my grandmother used to take her cast iron skillet and she'd brown the meatballs in the skillet. And the first problem with that is you're putting a sphere on a flat surface, and you're going to get flat spots, and you're not going to evenly brown that meatball. So what I do with the meatballs is I put them on a broiler pan. A broiler pan is got two parts. It has a bottom, and then the top part is perforated, so all the grease will go and drip down into the bottom part of the pan. And I brown those meatballs on a super high setting in my oven, which is like 450 convection bake, and it winds up browning the meatballs equally around. And I only cook the meatballs until they are just barely done. Okay, they're cooked all the way through. And then the next thing I'll do, I'll tell you after I tell you what my grandmother did, and this was another error that the old Italians did, because they believe the longer you cook meat, the more tender it gets, and that applies for tough cuts of meat, but it doesn't apply to ground meat. And the longer you simmer the meatball in the sauce, the harder it gets and the denser it gets, and you wind up with a hard meatball. My grandma's meatballs were hard. They were delicious, but they were hard. You don't want to simmer them in the sauce all day. You don't even necessarily want to simmer them in the sauce at all. So what I do is, when the meatballs are done from the browning process, I put them in a baking dish. I cover them with sauce, and then when I need the meatballs, I just warm them. I just make sure they're warmed through. And what you end up getting is a very tender, flavorful meatball that's not overcooked. The other tip I could give you is, when making the meatballs, have a bowl of water, and then in between each meatball, dip your hands in the water. I use kitchen gloves, and what that winds up doing is it keeps the fat from building up on your hands. You will get because the fat will rub off and you'll build layers of it. But by putting your hands in the water, keeps the fat off your hands, and you can, the meatballs will roll off real easy. So that's my secret, guys. Heavy cream and pesto are two ingredients that most people don't use. You have to use a ton of cheese. I mean, a ton of cheese. And not too many breadcrumbs, because the old school, they used a lot of breadcrumbs because they wanted to stretch the meat out. And in doing that, you get a meatball that's very bready. And, we don't like that. We want a meaty meatball. And the breadcrumbs, we put a smaller amount of breadcrumbs in there. And what that winds up doing is that helps hold the heavy cream in there. And the meatballs, they'll be so juicy and so rich, like it'll blow you away. I'll post some pictures when the meatballs are done. I make about maybe about 10 pounds of everything when it's all assembled. It takes me 2 to 3 hours, so I'm about to head in the kitchen and do that. If you have any questions, you could always call me. The meatball hotline's always open. And that's all I got for you now, guys.